There we go. Fantastic. Welcome, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. Today, we'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance, and I will start that when Leah puts up the picture of the flag.
Okay.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I didn't see the flag go up that time, but I think we all got the point. Welcome, everyone. So I have the thought or legislative prayer tonight. We are living in an extraordinary and unprecedented times, and through unprecedented circumstances. I thought a lot about what I wanted to say tonight. There's so much that I could say, and there's so much that I want to say about what's happening in our community and what's happening in our country and what's happening around the world. I ran across a quote that I think sort of encapsulates a lot, that all of those pieces. It's a quote that's been attributed to Albert Einstein. There's some controversy over whether he said it or not. I frankly don't care, because I thought that the quote was really fitting. So, and the quote is this: learn from yesterday, live for today, hope for tomorrow. And I thought that that really kind of summed up where I am these days. So we have a lot on our agenda today, so let's go ahead and get started. First item up, we have an administrative decision. This is the Hive Conceptual Site Plan. So I will turn the time over to staff.
All right, thank you, Chair Heyman, members of the commission. As anticipated for this meeting, that staff would be providing you a report outlining our recommendations. And so in your attachments, you should see both under the conceptual site plan item, as well as the conditional use permit item related to the Hive. There's links in both of those matters to the same memo that contains the staff recommendation, and it has it both for conceptual site plan and for conditional use permit, as well as some backup attachments to the previous staff reports and submittals for your reference as you debate and make a decision. Just by way of logistics, we know that you've been very patient as a commission and during a couple of Zoom meetings, quite intensive public comment period that included the Zoom meetings and the written comment. I think we had a little bit of a spirited debate. This is a complicated project with a lot of matters to be addressed, and also it affects a number of people, which I think all of you have shown great patience in listening and allowing people to tell their stories. As far as staff recommendations go, we're kind of logistically letting the staff report speak for the recommendations. I'll summarize the matter that under the conceptual site plan, the conceptual site plan is a concept or a SketchUp of what the anticipated development would look like. The purpose of the concept plan is not to approve a final product yet. That would come with a secondary step where they would prepare final documents and construction drawings related to a proposed development. So the purpose of conceptual is for you to review the zoning ordinance standards, and hopefully we covered them in our reports to you. Also, it's an opportunity for you to debate the merits in compliance with those standards. And then afterwards, you would give directions to the applicant what they need to do to comply with the ordinance. And I do reference in the staff report that any directives and conditions that you assign are for the administrative purposes to comply with the zoning ordinance. And so that is your narrow view, is to look at the ordinances and give them the instructions or directives on how to comply. And so our staff recommendations tries to summarize those compliance. We did not go through and outline every little item of the ordinance. We reviewed the site plan, and we believe that much of the site plan addresses the zoning standards. And so we did recommend references to the sheets that they submitted. And the purpose of a conceptual is also to drive the final design of the final site plan. And so we reference all of those submittals that were provided to you by the applicant, because most of that is expected to be used to draw up and draft the final site plan and construction documents. So that was how we summarized the various elements and added some reminders for the code on a few screening and lighting items. As to the conditional use permit, since we've been addressing them together, we did not anticipate, nor has it been historically precedence of the Planning Commission to issue a conditional use permit at a concept. The reason being is much of the expectation of the design criteria or the approval criteria for the conditional use permit is also hitched to the site plan. So impacts of where parking is, where landscaping is, where building heights will be located are all also included in the site plan. But additionally, you can move to other types of review under the conditional use. And again, this is for those additional units above 8 units of the base zoning. You can look at impacts created by the project and outline measures to study or mitigate. And I think a good example that's been brought up in multiple comments, not only by staff and the commission and the public, is the concern about traffic. And we knew that very early on. And so an example would be is that we've recommended tabling the conditional use permit in its final decision until a traffic study is provided to see if there is an impact and what would need to be mitigated in their fair share of that impact. We also raised the issue in the conditional use permit to make sure that the fire department looks at it for adequate fire protection. That's definitely one of the criteria of the CUP. And also we added, I believe, a component looking at the stormwater management plan. Not only is that a site plan issue, it is also a potential impact issue. And so we outlined that those kind of studies or engineering take place as part of preparation of the final site plan. One thing that came up in several of my conversations with individuals talking about the conditional use permit was how much is a burden of the CUP submittal, the obligation of the developer, and what is the role of the city in approving that conditional use permit. And I find it a fascinating question, because this is one of the few times that the participants in the process actually read the city ordinances and called with questions. And so I found that as a huge bonus of discovery, is that the general public at large took the time to read the ordinance. There's certainly a burden on the developer in their submittal to show how they are mitigating impacts or how they would do that. So there is a burden for them to, for an example, is to, if deemed, which staff is recommending a traffic study, then the burden would be is that they perform that traffic study to see if there is a mitigation need. However, is equally on the side of Centerville, in spite of the maybe tone taken into the conditional use permit, state law also dictates what we're to do with the conditional use permit. So if I can get our city recorder to allow me to screen share. Is that okay? Leah, if I can screen share.
You should be able to. Is it not allowing it?
It says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Okay, how's that?
Let's look at, there you go. Thank you very much. I hope all of you can see this. I've looked at the state code and provided this clarification. The major clarification is in red in the screen. Again, this is state ordinance, so this is our obligation as a city. A conditional use shall be approved. That's an emphasis. In 2005 general session, there was a big debate on how conditional uses are utilized within municipalities. In the historic past, in the long past, conditional uses were a catch-all phrase. You would see ordinances call out a few uses that they would allow as a permitted, and then a whole bunch of other uses would be conditional use. And the way historically municipalities and county treated it is we would allow it as a conditional use if we like it or if we're okay with it. And that became problematic, particularly in counties. Counties had a lot of land uses assigned as conditional uses. And so the state in 2005 stepped in and said, if you list a conditional use, here is your obligation. Your obligation is a conditional use shall be approved if reasonable conditions are proposed or can be imposed to mitigate the reasonably anticipated detrimental effects of the proposed use. And so that is the default view of administrative decision, is that you are to approve it if there are reasonable conditions. That doesn't mean that every item is solvable or every problem is addressed. Is if it's reasonably mitigated, reasonably taken care of, then you can establish standards and apply that to the obligation of an applicant. I don't want to say that there is no ability to say no to conditional use, because item B, 2B, says that if there are detrimental impacts and they can't be substantially mitigated, you can find that there's no way to mitigate them in a substantial manner, then the second option is you can consider denying the conditional use permit. But that's a high standard. You've got to find that there's no way to mitigate it in a substantial way, and then you can deny it. So at this point, with the staff recommendation, we don't believe that there is enough information to approve it, but we certainly don't believe that there's a substantial inability to mitigate, such as traffic or fire access and use. And so we're recommending a few conditions that be tabled, that they be tied to the application of a final site plan, and that then we would make a decision if the additional 9 to 12 needs any mitigation, and what would those standards be to mitigate. And from our standpoint, we believe that it is more than likely that they can be mitigated rather than unlikely that they can be mitigated. So our recommendation is to table the conditional use and tie it to the final site plan. And so those are our two recommendations. We can answer any questions or what we'd like from here.
Thanks, Corey. Any questions for staff before we start discussing this one? Kevin, I think that you are asking a question, but you're on mute.
Yeah, there we go. Sorry. I thought I clicked it, but I guess I didn't. Anyway, Corey, quick question, just as a clarification for conditional uses. In this particular case, 8 units per acre are permitted, and then up to 12 are conditional. However, we, as a planning commission, can't say it appears you can mitigate up to 10, so we're going to approve up to 10, right? Or is it all or nothing on the conditional up to 12?
That's a great question. I think this is probably something that was used in historic past. I think this gross density of 9 to 12 was used in the 2003 adoption of the code. And remember, conditional uses were changed by the state view in 2005. I think it's rather difficult to substantiate a difference between 10 and 11 units. And so I think, you know, the difficulty of it is that the assignment of a range of 9 to 12 is probably not the best way to handle density anymore. I think you would have to find a substantial finding that there is something between, let's just use an example, 10 and 11 or 10 and 12 that changes the fact that it can't be substantially mitigated. And so I think that the range from 2003 is probably problematic to sector out the number. I think we're actually dealing with 12. And then if the future of 12 is too many, we could change that to something, say like 10. But I do think that the range poses a difficulty to substantiate the difference between a 10 or 11 unit density.
I was actually going to
Yeah.
ask a little bit according to, did you want to say something, Kevin?
No, go ahead. That's fine. Go ahead.
Well, I was actually wondering if the traffic study would give information, because obviously the CUP would be 50% more, and there's a percentage amount that allows, you know, 9 to 12 is if it would be 50% more than what is allowed. If we were to see
It would be a
something in the
third more.
traffic study,
It'd be a third more, not 50%.
sorry, 8 units, and then you add 4 more, that's 50%.
It's 4 more.
Yeah, you're going from 53 to 80, so it's less than half.
Sorry, well, they could go up to 50% is what I'm saying. So, so if the traffic study comes back and says, you know, anything about percentages or something, that's where I was kind of interested to know kind of what Kevin was saying. Would there, if there were something where it'd be like, well, we don't want to just completely reject this CUP because there is some flexibility with a little bit, but maybe it's not like, oh yeah, it's okay, you know, 50% up to 50% more or something, you know?
Yeah, I can give you an example from my perspective, not specific to this development because we don't have the traffic study in the detail. So let's just use a generic traffic example. Let's say that it's an understanding that at a certain intersection, you need to put in a light. And let's just use a round number of $100,000. The traffic study is going to go in and determine the percentage, and that's why you see the staff report talking about fair share. You could say that the system improvement manages X number of cars that are not related to this development. And that'll obviously be a larger portion of the community share of the system improvements than a product that's adding some traffic. So let's say that the project adds a 10% need to that upgrade. And so then the traffic study would say, well, this fair share percentage is $10,000 towards that light. If they pay that fee, the traffic fee, I wouldn't call it a fee, but if the impact is that you pay your 10% fair share to that traffic mitigation, they've mitigated their fair share. So it doesn't let you parse out that 10 or 11 is a fair share. It can be mitigated with 10,000 for the additional 12 units. Where this was applied is look at Walmart. Walmart back in 2004 and 2005 paid $18,000 towards improvements to Parish Lane and an additional money towards the ramp on I-15. It was a conditional use. The traffic study said their fair share of impact is X number of improvements, and then the X number of improvements, their fair share is this dollars. And so Walmart went ahead and paid to their fair share of that traffic study, and those improvements went in either under UDOT or city projects. And so part of the ramp that you see that is built next to the 7-Eleven was built with some funds from Walmart. And so I think that's where there's an idea. It would be difficult to take $10,000 and say, well, we're going to only let you mitigate 8,000 of it instead of 10,000 of it. if they can mitigate it with 10,000, then they would get the full 12 units per acre.
Thanks, Corey. Any other questions for staff?
Corey, while we're on the topic of traffic studies, are we able to designate which traffic engineer we will have the developer utilize for that study? I guess what I'm getting at is there may be some that are more conservative or more aggressive toward the benefit or detriment of the city and the public versus to the developer. Just throwing that out there as a developer, not really actually knowing that. I just used other traffic engineers on projects of my own and not thinking about it until today.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, certainly there are qualifications of traffic engineers, and hopefully there, as a developer, would pick an adequate engineer to do it with a good reference history. But I don't think we can dictate who they hire. They would hire someone, and then we would have a check against that traffic study with our city engineer, which is ESI, and ESI also is capable of looking at traffic studies and identifying if it's a reasonable conclusion of the model that they use. So we would end up with a second opinion of
Perfect.
whatever they submit.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for staff? No. Seeing none, so we have two matters before us. The first is whether we approve the conceptual site plan. The second is whether we grant the conditional use permit. I'm going to start backwards because I'm just curious. Let me take sort of a rough tally. Is there anyone who feels like we should move forward with the conditional use permit now at the conceptual stage rather than waiting until the final site plan is approved by staff? Okay, so it sounds like everybody then is comfortable tabling the conditional use permit application pending the additional information that the city has requested, and then we'll consider that in connection with the final site plan. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that just real quick, Shailen, I think, I would be in favor of using that tabling motion, suggested tabling motion in the staff report and dealing with that way.
Yeah, I felt pretty strongly. I was not prepared to grant the conditional use now. I think that we need more information before we can make that decision. So with regards to the conceptual site plan application, anyone have any concerns with regards to whether they have met just the conceptual stage? I know that's a pretty low bar. Oh. If we have no discussion on this particular one, the chair will entertain a motion.
I got it. I hereby make a motion for the Planning Commission to accept the conceptual site plan application submitted by CW Urban for the proposed development project located at 55 North 400 West, subject to the directives 1 through, hang on, gotta make sure I didn't skip ahead, 1 through 7 in the staff report, and reasons for action A through E.
I'll second that, just noting for those who may not understand, I think that they've met every one of the low bars necessary for approval, and we have no other option other than to approve it because they've abided by the ordinance.
Yeah, that's my view as well, Mason. It's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion or debate on this? If not, let's take a roll call vote. We'll start with you, Commissioner Summerhays.
And I would just add to the record, I think nobody wanted to be the first one out. Kevin did it, but just because we know it's been a sensitive issue as a commission, we know there's a low bar like Commissioner Kerr said, but aye is my vote.
Thanks. Commissioner Wright,
Aye.
Commissioner Kerr,
Aye.
Commissioner Daly,
Aye.
Commissioner Wilcox,
Aye.
and I'm an aye as well. Thank you. And with regard to the conditional use permit application, the chair will entertain a motion.
I'll lead out on that one. I would propose a motion as detailed in staff report, for the reasons detailed in staff report, that we table this until a final site plan has been submitted.
And I would just point out that in the staff report under 2B as in boy, the word through is misspelled. Not a big deal, but just for purposes of the minutes. Okay, sorry, there's a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion or debate? We'll go backwards this time. Commissioner Wilcox,
Aye.
Commissioner Daly,
Aye.
Commissioner Care,
Aye.
Commissioner Wright,
Aye.
Commissioner Summerhays,
Aye.
and I'm an aye as well. Thank you all. That takes care of matters 1 and 2 on our agenda. So moving next to our third item on the agenda, this is another administrative decision, a conditional use permit involving Edmunds Auto. So I will turn the time back over to staff.
Thank you, Chair Heyman and members of the commission. So this item is another conditional use permit application. This one, the applicant is Edmunds Car Company, and I believe our applicant Robert Edmunds is here tonight with us. He has requested a conditional use permit for vehicle rental or sale used limited use, which just means he wants to sell used cars. But we have specific definitions for used versus new, cars versus boats. As stated in the staff report, this use is allowed in the industrial high zone, which is where this would be located, but conditionally. And so I don't have many things of note from the staff report, just that it is in the industrial high zone. There have been several limited use vehicle sales operations approved in the past, so it's not a real change to the neighborhood. And staff believes that since most of the vehicles will be stored indoors, and there will not be very many vehicles for sale at one time, that it won't have much impact on the neighborhood. The only thing that could impact the neighborhood is the arrival of vehicles by transport truck. And in the staff report, let's see if I'm looking at the right one. Yep, okay. The applicant provided some logistics of how transport trucks would deliver automobiles if the transport truck is how they would get them. And the way that they listed is using the public street. So this is not ideal because there is no way within the parcel that this unit is on to have the transport truck come in and turn around. So they have stated they would use the public street, which we don't love. We have restricted that use in the past. So in the staff report, in the proposed motion, I added number 5, which is up to you whether you want to restrict the use of those transport trucks and only allow limited towing trailers. And then they have enough parking to meet needs. And then let's see if there's anything else that stood out particularly in this case. No, I think that is all. Staff recommends approval with the conditions. And I noted just before the meeting in my review of the conditions, condition number 2 that I wrote up should say vehicle rental or sale used limited, just to clarify what the actual use is. Otherwise, staff recommends this application.
Thanks, Mackenzie. Any questions for staff?
I have one. So this may stem from a misunderstanding, but I'd like to ask a few questions about the cut bop conditional use that we approved when I wasn't here a while ago. and then recently revisited sort of when we did some discussions about that same parcel as it as the salon was looking at different options. And one of the points that came up at that time was the feeling that perhaps during the cut-bop conditional use, we had given enough to the cut-bop applicant that it meant then restrained uses on other property owners. And that's my primary concern here, because, and unless I'm mistaken, someone correct me, but this is not, this use is not for the whole building. This building has other uses that could be or are attached to it. And I'd like to understand how that's going to impact their potential uses. If you could help me understand that better, please.
Okay, you're correct. So on this site, there are 2 flex space buildings. The first building, phase 1, has sufficient parking. There's 30 parking stalls total, and the first building uses about half, or requires about half. I don't think they use all of those. And then the second building has 3 tenant spaces, one of which is used by the owner of the property, who also occupies the first building, but is not a business commercial use. It's just a space. So we don't really so it requires very low parking because it's in essence warehouse. But there is a vacant tenant space left over, and this CUP could restrict that tenant space, because if they also wanted to come in and do vehicle sales, then there would be competing need for the parking stalls. So you're right. It is possible that by approving this CUP, that it could be creating a cut-bop situation. However, there currently are enough stalls for the listed uses when the building was built.
Mackenzie, can you clarify to me too? My understanding is Mr. Robert Edmonds was displaying his cars inside the warehouse rather than the parking lot.
That's correct. Yeah, so all the vehicles for sale will be in the building. So the 1 space for every 10 vehicles displayed, there will only be 10 or less vehicles. So that must be outside, but the state required 3 parking stalls provided for display vehicles can be provided indoors.
Mm-hmm.
Mackenzie, I've got a question on I just looking at a map. You're saying that there are multiple buildings or multiple suites within one building. I can't tell from the staff report if it's only 1 building or if it's 2 buildings. I'm just on Google Maps. Maybe it'd be helpful for the commission to understand exactly what this property overall encompasses and the parking associated with 1 or multiple buildings.
Can you throw that up, the Google map, on a shared screen so we can all be looking at the same thing?
Are you asking me or Mackenzie?
No, sorry. Do we have that ability? I meant actually just Mackenzie.
Let me Google it just a second. And if Leah gives me the ability, then yes.
Mackenzie, you can go ahead and discuss. I'll do that for you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So the reason it probably doesn't show on Google Maps is because the second building is brand new and completed in the last 6 months. So it's a long rectangle parcel. Pardon?
The Google map I'm looking at probably is just a slab on grade with maybe some of the walls up, but not the roof. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes. So there are 2 buildings on the lot. One, the original building, is the more northern building, and it only has 1 tenant. The second building has 3 tenant suites. And so this is an application for one of those tenant spots. One is vacant, the other is occupied by the owner for non-business purposes. So under the ordinance, it's not super clear, but would require few parking stalls. There we go. So it's on the left-hand side of this, near Precision Electronics, yeah. So parking was added along the frontage of the new building and along the easterly lot line.
And Mackenzie, I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but I think it relates to this. But one of our items on our agenda tonight is we're revisiting the inland marine application, wherein we're talking about delivery of RVs or boats and where they're going to bring those. And we've required that applicant to bring it onto their site as opposed to having it on the road, correct?
That's right.
So it would
That's
be
right.
consistent as a commission to require this applicant to do the same based off of what you're kind of recommending or not recommending as the item number 5.
Right. Item number 5 would require them to load and unload on their site without transport trucks.
I'm just trying to think through it in terms of fairness and continuity across the city.
Right.
Well, and to that point, that was a question that I had actually. This isn't our first vehicle sales conditional use permit we've done in this neighborhood. I think it's our 4th or 5th, maybe in the last few years. And I think that we've talked about these transport trucks as well. I thought the discussion in the past was the size of the transport truck, or did we actually say you couldn't do any loading or unloading on the street regardless of the size of the truck?
That's a question I can't answer because I wasn't here for most of those.
Yeah.
Yeah, you did. Hold on. You did to have a discussion on several of these. And we've had discussion on the size. I think the last one you distinguished between the semi and then the pickup truck with a trailer and allowed the pickup truck with a trailer to go, but not the large transport truck.
That sounds right. And I think that sounds reasonable as well.
Any other questions for staff before we invite the applicant to speak to this one? If not, we'll go ahead and we'll invite the applicant to step forward. I guess step forward is probably the wrong thing. Video this. Hi, if you'll just introduce yourself to us.
Sure. My name is Rob Edmonds. I've been in the car business for 17 years, and we plan on running just a small family operation with my wife and I. We're going to specialize in Toyotas. Newer Toyotas with low miles that are still within factory warranty. So we're really trying to, we'll be a good representative of the community, keep it really clean. We want it to be very professional. It's keep it sharp and high and tight for you guys. So and be a good neighbor.
Mr. Edmonds, what's your reaction to this 5th condition that staff has required with regards to loading and unloading vehicles limited to a 3-vehicle type?
Well, so I tried to address that and with the instructions that we can actually give the transport driver, I think that they can get in the area with little impact, because across the street from the building there, from the front building, in front of Outfitters there, it's just unused area with a chain link fence against it, to where if we did have a transport driver pull up, he could pull along the fence on 500 North there, where that holding area is for the construction equipment, with very little impact to traffic. But we can only hold about 8 vehicles, and that's about all my financing will allow anyway. So it's not going to be in and out with the transport truck. But we can try. I can try to request a 3-place hauler, but sometimes it gets a little bit tougher. But I have other options too. If need be, I can have them drop this vehicle off at Manheim, Utah Auto Auction in Woods Cross and pick up there. It's a 5-minute drive. So I would like to have to come up with a plan for the transporter, but it's obviously not a deal breaker. So
Thank you. Anyone else have questions for the applicant?
Yeah, I do. Sorry, I must have muted myself. I hit unmute and I think I stopped my video. What's the total parking lot stall count there that's allotted to the building as a whole?
37.
Okay.
That's for the entire facility. Is that
Okay.
correct?
Yeah, that's my question. And are you the owner of the building, or
No.
are you leasing?
No, I'll be leasing from Keith Brown. He's been there for years.
And do you know what the other uses are, either in the near future or current?
Yes, so they're going to be, one gentleman that has one side rented out is, he is a service. He does pipe fitting for gas fittings. So he's just using that as storage. He pulls a big trailer in there and leaves it. The other guy that is going to rent the building, I believe, is fixing or building cabinets, or he does interior stuff. So it's just service. It's going to be, I will be the only one that will have retail customers visiting the premises.
Okay. And the total stall count that you believe you're going to need out of those, and did you say 34?
37.
37. And so what percentage are you intending to need?
So my inventory levels will probably fluctuate, but not by much, right? Because I'm going to be so small. Most of my inventory will be stored indoors. But you know, if I need 3 to 4 stalls outside, if we run into some inventory or I get a special buy, it might be temporary. But the plan is, with as small as we are, to keep everything inside. And that was my plan initially, to do a warehouse, is to keep everything inside. Once it's been cleaned, it's in there, it stays clean, it stays safe from any break-ins, or at least theoretically.
Okay, and that's fair. What I'm wondering about right now is, let's just imagine in an alternate universe that you had 2 other competitors come in and occupy those spaces where you've got the pipe fitter and the cabinetry guy going. Is there going to be enough outdoor stallage to go around?
Plenty.
Okay. All right, thank you.
You bet.
Any other questions for the applicant? Seeing none, thank you very much, Mr. Edmonds. You can go ahead and on video. This matter has been scheduled for a public hearing. So if you would like to participate in the public hearing and you're participating via Zoom, there is a feature at the bottom right-hand side. If you click on participants, in the bottom right-hand side, there'll be a little feature that says raise hand. So if you'd like to comment, go ahead and click on that feature. If you are calling in via phone, you can also request to speak by hitting *9 on your phone. So I'm going to give it a few seconds and see if anyone steps forward. Technology is grand, but there's always a little lag. Oh, I see a hand, Kevin. Well, at least we know it's working.
Sorry, I
All
couldn't
right.
resist. I do have something to say
Leah,
later, but
I appreciate it. At least I could see that it was working. Leah, have we had anybody try to participate through telephone?
No.
No. Seeing no one come forward, we'll close the public hearing. Any further debate on this one?
I don't really have debate so much as I think we need to be careful as a commission. You know, a lot of applicants will speak to the current condition or their current plans and hope to get approval for that. Not that they're seeking to alter or do a bait and switch on a commission, but I think things always change. So as it relates to a transport vehicle and arriving and utilizing an adjacent property, that adjacent property's use is going to change. There's lots of things that can change. So I think we need to, as a planning commission, think of as if this were totally built out into the future on our decision-making process. So that'd be my only comment.
Yeah, and Corey, can you put back up the map, the Google map of this area? Because the applicant was saying that he could use this area on 500 North, this sort of unused area over here. But I'm not sure. I kind of had the same thought, Spencer. I'm not sure that use is going to stay the same. I know that in prior applications, and the one that I'm thinking of is the church facility over there on the west side where there was concern about parking, we required the applicant to go get a letter or an agreement from the adjacent property owner saying that they could use the adjacent parking if necessary. And I'm thinking if we don't restrict this to a 3-hauler type unit, and we do want to allow for larger conveyances because we think that they can use that adjacent property, I think it would give me some comfort to know that there was some agreement in place between the two property owners saying, yes, in fact, you have a contractual right to do that.
Jalen, you're talking about something that's like a deed restricted instrument, correct?
Yes.
I don't know that it was recorded, was it? It was just.
Was it recorded? Lisa, I can't remember. What did we do on that, the church one?
No, we don't require a deed restriction for that kind of.
No.
Okay.
That would be my question is, Lisa, what would be your suggestion then? If it's not a deed restriction?
Yeah, I think our ordinances actually specify what they have to do. We can look that up, but it's in some of the parking modifications. Well, I guess that would be by analogy. But obviously they can't unload in the public right of way.
Yeah, my suggestion would be look at it twofold so that the applicant can adjust if needed. Right now, there's no permission to use an adjacent property, and so relying on the use of that property for now would be unwise. And so I'm comfortable staff recommending a somewhat of a restrictive condition to the 3-hauler or whatever that can operate on site. And then if the applicant discovers that there's an opportunity to use off-site, they certainly can then amend their conditional use permit and come in and ask if you would approve an off-site location pending whatever approval agreement they can arrive with the property owner. So that way it still stays flexible that if he needs it in the future, he just knows to come in and amend his conditional use permit.
Yeah, and I think that's a good recommendation. It appears to be covered in the new condition number 5.
And I have a,
too.
oh, go ahead, Becky, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, without seeing any kind of agreement among property, neighbors, I don't feel comfortable just saying, yeah, like that could work either.
I tend to agree with that. I have a question for those of you that may have been here longer. For the other conditional uses that have been approved in this area for similar types of sales, have we approved anywhere nearby that allows these large trailers to unload?
I don't believe so.
I don't remember any.
No, most of all the car sales in the west side are using the flex office. And so they're usually 3 or 4 or 5 cars. We do not have a large dealer out here on the west side at this point.
Well, and I think we asked the applicant and they addressed it. They said, it sometimes gets mixed up, but that's not a deal breaker and that he could try to make that happen. I think hearing from the applicant that it's something that he could do, not having the neighbors having that on record as something as the alternative of using it with their neighbor, with their frontage, I think it just to me makes sense to keep that restriction in place.
I agree. I think as a planning commission, we need to look to the future and see if, and that property may not always be a holding lot for construction materials, and there may be several driveways right there. So a large transport doesn't make sense. And we certainly don't want to get to the point in the future where, that large truck pulls up in the middle of the street, sits there for, I don't know how long it takes, an hour to shuffle through a dozen cars at however many they hold and make a mess of the flow and the traffic there. So this is something that we've set a pretty clear precedent with this with other very similar applications in this neighborhood. So I'm comfortable to continue with it.
Yeah, if the applicant was to come forward and have an agreement in place to say, yes, we can use that staging area, I have no problem if a big truck wants to come in and pull out of there and not block the right of way. But in the absence of having that in place, I'm comfortable with the way that the staff report is drafted.
And Spencer, to your question, I don't think it was like a deed restricted. I think it was based on the use. So like if the use were ever to change, then the agreement between the property owners would have to be reviewed. And then that would also affect their CUP because their CUP was based on this agreement that they had already signed. So they would have to know that they know that the church knows that there's a chance that their CUP would be revoked if that agreement did not continue. So
Yeah, and I think I actually was misremembering on that. I think Lisa corrected me. It was a parking modification, not a conditional use permit, but I was making the analogy.
okay,
Um,
parking modification.
yeah,
I tend to agree with all of the comments. I could see a nearby property use being used as an unloading area. Even the property to the north on the private property, not on the land, may have enough use. But until the time that we come up with something specific, I am loath to allow or to rely on unloading and loading in the public right of way.
any further discussion on this? If not, the chair will entertain a motion.
I got it. I hereby make a motion for the Planning Commission to approve the conditional use permit request for Edmunds Car Company, subject to conditions 1 through 5 in the staff report and suggested reasons for action A through E.
Second.
I'll second.
I think Spencer got that one. Becky, you can be next. It's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion or debate? If not, we'll start with my people, sorry, have rearranged, so you'll have to listen for your name. Starting with Commissioner Kier.
Aye.
Commissioner Wright,
Aye.
Commissioner Summerhays,
Aye.
Commissioner Daly,
Aye.
Commissioner Wilcox,
Aye.
and I'm an aye as well. Thank you, everyone. For the applicant, if you have a question about that, I would encourage you to reach out to staff, Corey or Mackenzie, and they can help walk you through if you want to come back and try to do something different on that piece. Okay, moving right along to item number 4 on our agenda, another administrative decision. This is for a conditional use permit involving inland marine at 1040 North, 950 West. So I will turn the time back over to staff.
Thank you, Chair Heyman and members of the commission. So this item is similar to the previous item. We have also seen this before in April. There are a couple of differences, mainly the use is slightly different. This use requested is vehicle and equipment rental or sale in order to rent or sale boats. Those are 2 separate uses. It excludes motorcycles, automobiles, and light trucks. So if in the future this particular space wanted to do those things, they'd have to get a new conditional use permit or amend the one on the table. So the previous it was tabled in April, and the previous directives are noted in the staff report. Provide the location of vehicles for sale, propose information on loading and unloading of vehicles. The applicant has stated that the unloading and loading of vehicles will happen on the west side of the building, the rear of the building, away from the entrances for all of the tenant suites. They have provided, and it is attached, the uses and the required parking stalls for all of the current tenants. And if you look at that sheet of all the parking stalls, they have just enough parking for the current occupants. There's a suite that is vacant at the moment, and when that suite is leased, there won't be any parking left over for them. And so at that point, probably the building owner, the property owner, will need to come in for a parking modification request because there won't be enough parking. It's possible that in the whole Parish Creek Business Park that there will be extra parking between the 3 lots so that they could come to an agreement, or that could be part of the parking modification to share parking. But for the moment, for this current application, there is enough parking for this inland marine. The applicant also reached out to Coconut Cove, which is their next door neighbor, who runs an children's indoor recreation business, and received a letter from them, which is also attached, just making the owner of Coconut Cove aware of the possibilities of transport trucks, and that they recognize that they'll be in the back, and that it should not impact their business. Let's see if there's
Kinsey,
anything
while
else.
you're on it, can I discuss the history of that parking issue?
Go for it.
So originally, the project was approved as a typical flex space warehouse. So you end up with a small amount of office space at 5 per thousand, and then you end up with a large amount of warehouse space, which is 1 per thousand. So there's a drastic difference in a flex warehouse space in the number of stalls constructed. As the applicant went through the process and started leasing to uses like Coconut Cove, they also have a vehicle training center. I forget what brand of vehicle, but there's a training center there. It starts occupying more parking than the flex office warehouse. And one of those things that we notified the applicant in these tenant finishes is that if they continue this pattern of not doing office and warehouse, they will run out of their bank of stalls. And the developer owner of the property sent back an email recognizing that during a tenant finish, I believe, was it the vehicle training center? One of the uses. He acknowledged that there would be a potential pattern of falling short on the number of stalls. And there was some discussion about, what would need to be taking place if it gets to a point that they find enough uses that use up the stalls. And one of those discussions that always takes place is maybe the bane of many discussions among the commission is that they come in and modify the number of parking stalls based on actual uses rather than the table of the count in the parking ordinance. And to some degree, I'm okay with the modification because there are times that our parking counts might be too aggressive, and there's times that our parking counts might not be aggressive enough. There's an imperfection in understanding all uses and getting the correct count for all the uses. And so when it's good to maximize the number of building and reduce the number of parking, maximize the landscaping, but there comes a critical point where you create that conflict. So you can do the shared use scenario where you can look at off hours of use. You can modify under the parking ordinance the actual count based on use. And so based on use, when that use goes away, it returns back to the normal count for the next use. There's also a provision in the parking ordinance to use off-site stalls. And some of you may or may not remember, but when the Performing Arts Center was built, it did not have enough on-site parking for the theater. And so they exercised the off-site parking use and use the bank, the MTC, and even Colonial Lumber as a shared agreement for the off-site parking. And off-site parking has to be within 500 feet of the original site in order to be approved in the count. So one of the things is, could be critical of staff is how did you get it to this late point and now we've run out of stalls for this last tenant? Well, one is no good deed goes unpunished. And so somewhat staff is taking that punishment of the forewarning them and we're still running out of stalls. Where I don't feel as panicked about it is that the Parish Creek project is its own custom zoning and it's all tied together as a product. So there used to be there was 4 lots. They want to reduce it to 3 lots. The third lot's to the north. When they build that building, they'll eliminate one building and replace it with parking and combine the entire site. And so I look at, they may be running out of the bank for this particular parcel, but that bank with an offsite approval is probably large enough to accommodate this last tenant. We've not approved it to do that, agreed, but I compare it to their modifications they're planning to kind of like the Target. The Target complex is one big project and the parking is expansive through Home Depot and Target and smaller for the bank. But yet if you count all the product together, they have a sufficient number of stalls. And so I think that's just something to think about in the debate. Yes, they're running out and that could be problematic for them and they may have to come just specific to that site and get a parking modification. But the other option to them is to look at an off-site parking for the tenant space, which would then be conditioned on the third lot actually being constructed with all the future planned parking. And we may not have a problem. So again, no good deed goes unpunished. I'm saying I think there's opportunity to solve it, but it will be the burden of the applicant to ensure that if they run out of space on this site, that they qualify and build the necessary stalls for the last suite on the other site and get that off-site parking approval.
My question to that is there any way that, I mean, if we understand that there's an additional use left, an additional spot left, and the very bare minimum of that spot would be 1 per 1,000, right? Can we require them to reserve that at least to know that, okay, in order for this whole thing to work, the bare minimum of what you would have in that last spot would be this amount? Or does that not make any sense?
No, it makes sense. And I think you bring up a great point. You're looking at a conditional use and just like your last discussion, what are the future uses and how does it impact those future uses? And so I think you have a lot of discretion to decide about that with the conditional use. And if you're uncomfortable that they've run out of a bank of stalls and you want an answer of how that's solved before you approve this, I think that's totally within your purview.
Becky, I would just make a general observation as a developer in this matter. I think we would be wise to allow a private property owner to not lease space if they so chose.
That was my other thought.
Because for all we know, they may have some other arrangement with another tenant where they're getting outsized rents. And so they're going to agree to do that with another tenant, whereby they make up some of the financial repercussions on one tenant and not the other, and say, you know what, I'll lose some vacant space so long as I can get a higher rent somewhere else. So I think we don't want to get too, I get your point, but I also understand from the view of our other constituents are the property owner themselves. And so we need to be sensitive to that as well.
Well, and that's why I was asking that, because I thought there could be a couple ways the property owner could solve this. One is to reserve the bare minimum. The other is to just not even lease that last spot, which is again their choice for financial reasons. But then if I don't think of it in my view as the property owner, if I think of it in my view as the city instead of as the property owner, in the city, I have a requirement to make sure that my uses have adequate parking. So then that's where I kind of lean back to that argument of like, well, we have to make sure that we are approving things that won't be detrimental to these other surrounding areas. So the property owner, yeah, they could do what they would like to do, but as the city, we have to say, hey, this is what is required for this space usage, or not usage, this building. So we're going to follow that, and you can do what you'd like. You can either comply with that or not lease it and whatever, you know. So I don't know. I can see both ways.
Before we get too much into the debate on this one, does anyone have any further questions for staff before we invite the applicant to come speak to us on this?
I do. And
Go
this
ahead.
could go to either Corey or Mackenzie. And it actually helps me answer the tension between what Spencer and Becky have identified. So and I think I know the answer to this, so I apologize for what is probably a stupid question, but this building is not capable of being sold off into units or not parcels, but you know what I mean? Like there could not be separation of ownership into portions of this building. Is that correct?
Corey, you'll have to answer that one.
Yes, it's a lot with a large building with multiple tenants. And so unless they did some type of condo conversion of that building,
Right.
it's all one building with one lot.
So from that perspective, there's always going to be one person upon whom the buck would stop if for some reason the city put up big stop signs on what they can use. So that helps me at least from the perspective of, well, we'll discuss that later.
Any other questions for staff? If not, we'll go ahead and invite the applicant to pop up via video. I used to say invite the applicant to step forward. I'm not sure what the common terminology is with video. Looks like Nick Brady. If you want to unmute yourself, make sure that I'm saying your name right. If you'll just introduce yourself for us.
Sure. I'm Nick Brady, architect for Tom Stewart Construction and the developer.
Nick, I'm on as well.
Oh, hey, Lolo. There you go. I'll let you speak to this one.
And if you could just state your name for us.
Yeah, this is Lolo Tanifa, project manager for Tom Stewart Construction. And sorry, I kind of missed the front half of what you guys were saying.
Yeah. Do you have anything that you would like to tell to us about your application?
Yeah, so the first application that we were doing, the site Conceptual, I know the first go around, we got the information needed to present to you guys today. And so I would say we're more prepared on what we needed. So we have the site conceptual plan with the parking and the roundabout where we have the amenities, and Nick Brady has all the plans. Will you guys be showing that?
This is just for building E right now, Lolo, for the
building E.
Marine.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for that space, we're looking for a conditional use permit on that space. We did send in the letter from Coconut Cove to address some how they were gonna take safety precautions. We were Inland Marine was, and all their entry would be just from the east of the building. There's no entry from the back, or all the kids would just, the entry is just one from the east. And we got a letter from them and a letter of support from them. And we're also drawing up some safety precautions in the back of the building on the west side, where we would have signs and we would have just striping for caution as far as boats coming in and out.
Thank you. I appreciate that you got the letter from the Coconut Cove owner. I know that that was a concern that was raised during the last Planning Commission meeting. Does anyone have any questions for the applicant? It doesn't appear so. Thank you both very much. We appreciate it. This matter was not scheduled for a public hearing, so any further discussion or debate?
Yeah, so real quickly, the way I see this one, and well, very simply, the way I see this one, it's an administrative decision. So, you know, we get to decide, does this meet the requirements as established by the code? And yeah, it appears that it does. And if the property owner has painted himself into a corner for future uses, then that's on the property owner to figure out what they need to do to get out of that. But as far as this application before us, I see it pretty simply as an administrative decision. Does it meet the requirements, yes or no? And I feel like it does. So I'm inclined to support it.
Well, I would
Also, go ahead.
just say though, I mean, it's administrative, but it's a conditional use permit, and there are some factors that need to be mitigated, I believe. One of them is that we are supposed to make sure that we have enough parking for all of the building, right? Like, I mean, we look at obviously the use, and that's in one little spot, but it does affect all of the surrounding uses as well. So that's one thing that I agree, it is an administrative decision, but we do have to just, it's not just so cut and dry that it's like, oh yeah, it's just administrative and we're done.
Yeah, but it's not our decision. It's not our job to decide for the property owner what they're going to do with the rest of the building.
Right.
If the property owner, like had been discussed previously, Spencer brought this up, and I think you mentioned this as well, Becky, that if the property owner decides not to lease out the rest of that building, that's their decision. They get to decide to do that. That's their call. And it's not our job to decide how the rest of the building gets, dealt with. And so I understand, I agree with you. It's a conditional use and we need to look at mitigating the impacts. But in this case, we're looking at mitigating the impacts of the existing tenants and the existing uses. And I feel like that they've done that.
So let me just put a hypothetical to you. So we approve this, it goes through, then the owner puts out and leases this last unit and says, I'd like a parking modification. And we say, no, we're not going to grant a parking modification. You knew this in advance. This is something that you didn't plan for. And they say, well, you're not letting me use my property. How we're supposed to use it? So we're putting ourselves in a spot where we automatically are not complying with our parking regulations. We're putting ourselves in a spot where the owner is going to, come back and say, well, I should be able to use my property. So I think if there's a way that we can help the owner understand, I don't know if it's to tie it to the conditional use permit or do something, I don't know, maybe there's not, but I would be less inclined if we've already reached out to the owner, told them about this situation, they recognize the situation and yet still proceed forward. If they're coming to us later with a request for parking modification, it seems like that's not great management, and it's also not really following what our ordinance is asking.
Mason, I know that you were up and you wanted to make a comment. If you wouldn't mind my sneaking in here, I appreciate your concern, Becky. What resolves it for me is not only is it the business owner's sort of problem to deal with, but we also have the option of the offsite parking. So I think that we're not necessarily painting ourselves into a corner, because it sounds like from what Corey says, that the way that this complex is built, that they may very well be able to work out a deal with adjacent property and be able to provide the required parking, and is also consistent with what we require with regard to parking. Sorry, Mason, thanks for letting me speak. You had something to say.
That's good. And in fact, I agree and disagree with all three of you. and in the sense that Becky's identified the way that this owner may push us up against a wall and put us in a hard spot 2 years from now, I don't like that. I don't like that feeling. I want to take care of it now. And I don't like the fact that we've got assurance, some promise that maybe the development will turn out fine. But that's not here. That's not now. That's maybe in the future. But I'm also sensitive to Kevin and what Spencer said. I don't like micromanaging either. That isn't our role. It's just to determine whether or not they're in compliance with the ordinance. So as I look through this, I feel like maybe there's a condition in the conditional use, so a conditional use, that we could inject something in there. And this would be a question for Lisa. Lisa, tell me if I'm getting too creative. Where if we're going to approve the conditional use, that it be conditioned on non-use of that tenant space of some sort. And if they want to pivot out of that, then they need to renegotiate this conditional use. And if at that time there is no offsite parking, then they're up against the wall.
Yeah, I guess I'm hesitant to, find another leased space with this application, but I think if the Planning Commission finds some detrimental effects on the parking, like Corey said, have them come back with some solution. But I think that this application meets the ordinances, and it's up to the developer to deal with the problem in the future. And we deal with this quite a bit. There's a lot of multi-tenant projects, and we're always telling them you're limiting yourself on the next one. So it's not something new.
Lisa, what's your thought on sort of it's reasonable to look at the fact that this building requires at minimum one spot per 1,000 or whatever, knowing that that hasn't been utilized, that last little part, requiring that as part of the condition.
Well, how far off are they? I don't know enough about the parking counts and the building ownership, and
I don't even know how far off they are if I look at it.
probably need more information about the ownership and
I
where they
think-
are.
I could roughly answer that. Oh, is Lolo here? No, okay. So they have currently, for all the uses, they have 2 extra stalls. If, like what Becky mentioned, just requiring the minimum for a warehouse for that extra tenant, that would require 6 parking stalls, so they'd be 4 short. So it's not a huge difference.
Or if they did a retail, Mackenzie, then they would be subject to a higher parking ratio. And I guess I get what you're saying, Becky. You want to prevent a problem from occurring, but I think you could make that application in life in a lot of different ways. We want to prevent a lot of things from happening, but pardon maybe the crude example, it's not Minority Report that we're trying to play here. In terms of, well, you guys might lease this space and therefore I'm not going to let you utilize the building in its current state. So I think we need to be careful. I know you don't want to have them come again. And I guess what they may do is they may come to us again and they may figure out a way around it. Or they may say, hey, I want more parking. And we're going to say, hey, you knew what you were getting into? No.
And I guess my question too is, are there any uses that could fit in these last 2 spots that, I guess the lowest use?
So Lisa, you've got 5,800 square feet. So even a warehouse, you would have to do, 1 stall per 1,000. So you're talking almost 6 stalls. You're too short right now. You wouldn't even be able to use it as a warehouse.
You're already out of parking.
Yeah.
So Spence, I understand what you're saying about, like, we don't want to tell them how to use it. But I think what you're saying is like, let's not assume that they're going to use that. And I'm saying it's a building. I'm going to assume that they're going to use it, because to assume that they're not going to use it is kind of like not typical, I guess, to say, oh yeah, there's a building there. Let's just assume they're not going to use it. They can do whatever they want. They can just not use it. That to me seems like a pretty creative way of saying, like, don't tell people what to do. They have a whole building there. They're never going to use it. So I just think if we could somehow get to a point where it's like, yeah, they might want to do retail. They might want to do whatever they want to do. But the fact that the bare minimum, we have a requirement of bare minimum of what is required for this space, right? So to me, it makes sense. I don't feel like I'm telling them how to use it. I'm not telling them they have to use it. I'm just saying for the space, we need to be able to have this much. And if we don't have that left over and you've already used out all this other spot, the assumption would be that you would use a building when it's built. I don't think that's a weird assumption to make.
So let me, in the interest of time, but I think here's a scenario to play out with you. What if this building were all retail? They would be under park right now. So
it can't be all retail, right?
Right.
Corey?
Because of based on the ordinance that we have, unless they were to set up the site in a way that had more parking, it is not possible for this to all be retail. It's
Right.
limited based on what the physical structure is of the lot.
Right. And what my point is that it was set up with it was set up as a flex office warehouse, correct, Corey? You're shaking your head, which means there was an anticipation that it would be utilized a certain way. We weren't sure how they would use it floating back and forth. And so again, my point is I don't know that we want to get into the weeds in determining how they're going to use their space. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay.
I feel like we've built a pretty good record on this one with regard to our concern about the parking. I think if they come back to us with another use and say, we want a parking modification, I think that there's going to be plenty of evidence on the record when we look back at this one to say, we warned you when we approved this, that you are going to be significantly limited unless you came up with something else. And I have no problem saying no. If they come back and they say, I have a space and we want to do X with it because we don't want it just laying out there empty, but we can't really make the parking work, I'm very comfortable saying, well, sorry, you know, it is what it is. But that's
Well,
just me.
that being said, would it be appropriate to add a finding in here that, you know, the planning commission finds that while parking is currently sufficient, future uses may be parking constrained? I don't know if that's appropriate to add in here.
Well, and I guess that goes back to telling the property owner. So if we say yes to this, we're telling the property owner they can't utilize that last space. So,
but I don't think that that's true, because they may be able to come back with us and say, but we found adequate offsite parking within the 500 feet, just like what Legacy Theater did with the Colonial. So yeah. I think that it's possible that they could come back and do something else, but I'm going to be pretty strict if they come back to me and ask for a parking modification, because I think that we've clearly put them on notice that we have some concerns.
I like
I have one final question, and maybe Corey, you would know this. Let's imagine that after we finish all of this and we approve the CUP, next week, the owner of the property allows somebody to come in and start using that vacant spot as a warehouse. They wouldn't be coming back to us for any kind of approvals for that, correct?
Well, I think it's constrained already. If this is approved, there's only 2 stalls. And so they would have to parse off the warehouse space to equal 2 stalls, or the staff would turn down the business license request until they provide an adequate parking. And then it would come back to the commission. And then just by way for your understanding, a parking modification is at the discretion of the commission. It's not that you meet this criteria, we approve it.
That was what I wanted to make sure I understood. So that the check and the balance on making sure that they're in conformity with the parking stall requirements is going to be at business licensing, not necessarily back with us again. Possibly.
Correct.
Thank you.
Business licensing or a building permit process.
Or a tenant finish permit. Yeah, if they did a tenant finish permit, we would withhold the approval of the tenant finish until they solve their parking count.
Okay,
issue.
Thank you.
Kevin, I like the idea of adding some finding that at least shares on the record this conditional use permit. Maybe we approve the conditional use permit, but there is a finding that this is maxed out or something, you know, like, at least so it's on the record there.
I would be supportive of including that in a finding. Does anyone want to take a stab at maybe revising sub C to say that?
I just want to say, if you're going to add that kind of condition, just state the facts that it leaves 2 stalls left, not that it doesn't meet the code, because again, they can ask for a parking modification or they can do offsite. So it's not necessarily, you know, in violation of our code until they solve it.
Not that it's a condition, that just the finding is that we only have 2 spots left for the thing.
Yeah, that's fine.
Under its current use, Becky. I like that.
Use.
Under its current use.
That's a good point. Kevin, here's your idea.
Yeah, but I'm not really good at crafting that stuff. Shaylin's writing something down, I can tell. She's crafting language, attorney style.
I mean, I don't know that I love my language, but I think I think what I would do is just add on a provision under suggested reasons for action C. Take out the period at the end of report and put a semicolon and say, with the understanding and acknowledgement that based on the current use, that leaves only 2 remaining stalls. I don't know. What do you think, Lisa?
I'd probably say based on the current uses.
Based on the current uses.
Of the property.
Of the property, that leaves only 2 remaining stalls,
Parking stalls.
parking stalls.
And I guess you could even say, and future uses may be constrained.
I like that.
Constrained or prohibited.
I like constrained, but
Okay.
really solve it. You know, yeah,
All right.
Just go with constrained.
As long as the owner is clearly aware, like, we understand this, you understand this, this is your choice, but we do have requirements, base requirements in our city. So as long as they know that, then I feel more comfortable granting this.
Okay, so I think I've crafted this to read semicolon with the recognition and understanding that based on current uses of the property, comma, that leaves only 2 remaining parking stalls and future uses may be constricted. Period.
I like it.
Did she say constricted or constrained?
Constrained.
Constrained. What did you say, Lisa?
I don't know if it's different. in legal.
constrained, but now I'm gonna look them up. Which one's better?
I know, I knew Lisa would look up the difference. I knew that there would be some kind of difference, but I don't know what it is.
I'm okay with constrained. I think I was trying to write quickly and I couldn't read my own handwriting.
Okay, constricted is narrowed, especially by encircling pressure, or inhibited and restricted. So that definition would be appropriate. Let's see, constrained.
Only lawyers would care so much about the difference between constricted. Say it again, I'm sorry.
You're enforced or overly controlled and severely restricted in scope, extent, or activity. I like constrained.
Okay, let's go with constrained.
That was fun.
Any further discussion or debate on this one? Okay, if not, I will go ahead and make a motion for the Planning Commission to approve the conditional use permit request for Inland Marine at 1040 North, 950 West, Suite 500, subject to conditions 1 through 5 in the staff report for suggested reasons A through C, as modified, as we just discussed, using the word constrained.
I'll second that.
It's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion or debate? All right, let's start with Commissioner Daly.
Aye.
Commissioner Wilcox.
Aye.
Commissioner Summerhays.
Aye.
Commissioner Wright.
Aye.
Commissioner Kier.
There.
Kier, Lord, I'm sorry, dude. One of these days I'm gonna get your last name right. Kier.
Aye.
Kier.
Aye.
I see that J in there and I try to put in some sound for it, Kier, and I'm an I.
Don't worry about it.
You should always give me a hard time. My first name is Shaylin, so I'm very. All right, thank you guys. Moving on to item number 5, last substantive item on our agenda tonight. Another administrative decision, another conceptual site plan, this one for Parish Creek Business Park, Building B. I'll turn the time back over to staff.
Thank you, Chair Heyman and members of the commission. As Corey stated for the Hive, an explanation of conceptual site plan. This is not the last time that we will see this. There are some things that could change, but this tells us substantially what it would look like. This item was also tabled from April 8th, 2020 with a few directives. And for the most part, the applicant has met those directives. They have provided parking counts. They have provided more landscaping. They've provided building elevations. They've addressed the landscaping along Legacy Parkway. They have not provided parking counts for possible uses. So the main thing that I addressed in the staff report, or that staff addressed in the staff report, is that on the site plan, there are 83 boat parking stalls listed on the site plan. Currently, the building was built under the assumption of warehouse and office space. So they have provided more than enough parking for the warehouse and office space divisions that they listed on the site plan. They have many extra spaces for those two uses. However, if and when they seek a conditional use permit for boat sales, that may change. But as far as this application goes, they meet the requirements for the parking. In the staff report, under the bullet point subject to narrative and architectural concepts approved, it notes that while the boardwalks in the original plan were not specifically called out in the PDO agreement and ordinance, it was part of the attachment. And Lisa may want to weigh in on this. I debated whether leaving a condition that the applicant should seek a PDO amendment from the city council for those boardwalks, for the change out of those boardwalks. Because my reading of the PDO made it up for debate whether you could make that change on your own, or if that would have to go to the city council. But otherwise, I added the one thing that they didn't provide in this new in these new amendments is parking counts. So I made that a directive for the final site plan approval. But otherwise, staff finds that this meets the regulations in the ordinance, and that in the future, they'll need to get a conditional use permit for the boat sales that they appear to have planned for.
Mackenzie, if I can just weigh in. Mackenzie let me know this afternoon, looking through the exhibits in the PDO. I did look up in the subdivision improvement plans for the project. The boardwalks are required as part of the subdivision approval. And so at that point in time, they would have to go back in and amend their subdivision approval to find either elimination or an alternative way. So I think you just could call out a condition that sidewalk improvements be installed as per the subdivision approval. And then if it gets amended differently, that would be the tool to amend it.
So it sounds like that's not something that we need to decide tonight. That's going to be in a separate decision.
Yeah, so I think I would just recommend that you can put it in as a condition that we review the possible amendments to the subdivision and the PDO, and then staff can check on those between now and final.
Great. I was concerned about that, so thank you.
Okay. Any questions for staff?
I have a question only because I don't have history. I think this started before I was on the commission. So Mackenzie or Corey, just walk me through. It says the conceptual site plan, and you referred to it, listed the intended uses as office, warehouse, and incubator. I guess what we're potentially approving, or what's on the application tonight, is to approve those uses. But in the future, if they choose to go to a different use, which is the boat parking stalls that are showing on their site plan now, they're going to have to come in for a CUP at that point. That is not part of this approval. Did I state that correctly?
That's correct. But
Okay.
if
Yeah, and
they,
I would clarify that if the applicant understand that if they are moving away from the flex space incubator and they have intent, they ought to disclose that change of intent with their final site plan.
And I guess to follow up that question from a land use planning perspective, does that really bother some of the commissioners that we're moving away from the intended use completely, or potentially moving? I mean, if they're showing boat stalls on their site plan now, they're moving that direction. Come on, let's just be honest. Does that bother any of the commissioners from a city land use perspective? I don't know.
Before we get into substantive discussion on that point, let's go ahead and finish asking staff if they have any questions, and we can. No, you're totally fine. Great question, but let's let the applicant weigh in before we start debating that one. Any other questions for staff?
I have probably a stupid question. When Corey was saying, is this the other development that you were talking about where it turned into one building?
Yes,
This is, and then this is the additional parking you were talking about.
correct.
Okay. So this is all connected to that first application thing.
Yeah, this will be a combining, there's lots 1 and 2, and I think you discussed the use on lot 1 in your previous application. This will be lot 3, and it's combining lots 3 and 4 together into one large development.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Any other questions for staff? If not, we'll invite the applicant to step forward by clicking on the video link, or if you're participating via phone. There we go. Is this you again, Nick?
It is, yeah,
Okay.
and Lolo.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I feel like we've gone through the conditions of the previous tabled items and addressed those with the information that we know now. So I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Or we've provided some renderings and some civil plans as well to address those previously requested items. So.
Can you address Commissioner Summerhay's question? I mean, is this heading down the boat road?
I know that's been a prospective tenant, and they've been looking at that and certainly wanted to kind of get it prepared in case that tenant or that lease was kind of moved forward to the next steps. But we obviously had to take the proper procedures to, ink that deal in case they did so they could plan for it. So that has definitely been of interest to provide for a boat dealership.
Any other questions for the applicant?
So are you the original applicant on when we did this? I guess, let me think. Going back to this original plan.
I'm the architect, but yet I believe that the developer that presented this originally, I'm their architect. So
This actually went through 2 renditions. It was the previous landowner was Rick Jensen, and he worked through to get to this point with a PDO, and then he sold, before anything was constructed, he sold that PDO approval to Tom Stewart Construction. And so Tom Stewart Construction has taken it from raw land to developed land.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for the applicant? Oh, seeing no one, thank you very much. We appreciate it. So this matter has not been scheduled for a public hearing. So any further discussion or debate?
I'll answer your question, Spencer. I don't like a bait and switch when people say, yeah, we're going to do this, and then actually we're going to do something else. But frankly, I don't even care if this is like a boat place, because it seems like an appropriate use in this area for me. I feel like even though maybe the original intent of the area was a little bit different than this, I still feel like a boat situation in that little, I mean, it's tucked away in a space that's like right there by that overpass that goes over. I feel like it's an appropriate use to me. I'm not, I mean, you can ask Corey that, because I'm not like the planner, but I think it's okay, even though I don't like being told we're going to do something and then being flipped to do something else.
Yeah, we're hoping that Becky converts to a planner and replaces me.
And I know we're a land use planning entity, so, and it's a CUP, so really, I mean, this gets back to our hive discussion, right? Well, I mean, really, what power would we have to say yes or no? And it's really mitigating factors, et cetera. But, if the city really wanted more office warehouse, tenants, creating more vibrancy in the city, using city retail and increasing tax base, that was kind of the question. Now, if you're selling boats, maybe that's going to be even better. So I don't know.
Well, and to be clear, the current application is just a conceptual site plan, not a CUP.
That's actually exactly what I was going to say. Pretty low bar on this one. I think, in my view, they've satisfied it, at least for purposes of a conceptual.
But again, it kind of goes back to like what Spence was saying, like when we know something's going to happen, it sort of feels like, oh, well, this is like, it feels like we're saying, I shall close my eyes and approve this, even though I know that this is going to be something like, I think that's sort of a weird way to live life, but.
And they also
Well, the applicant said that they're just thinking about it.
And they went from 3 buildings to 1 building, correct?
That's correct.
They'll still have to come back to us on final. So if it's, you know, they're taking that risk. If it's a total bait and switch and we don't buy it, then I mean, that's on them, in my view. Any other discussion on this one? Any further questions for staff? If not, the chair will entertain a motion. Wait, before we entertain the motion, Lisa, what was your proposed language that you would include with regards to the boardwalk? The 5th condition that you would add is review amendments to PDO. How would you phrase that?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just looking at the last condition. Yeah, I think just review subdivision approval and PDO approval as needed for amendment. Because we just need to review that along with the final site plan, because the final site plan may be conditioned upon subdivision amendment.
Yeah.
Eventually a PDO amendment. I guess you could just say review required amendments to subdivision plat and the PDO approval.
Okay, review required amendments to subdivision plat and PDO approval as the 5th condition. All right, well, since I've written that down on my paper, I will make a motion to approve the amended conceptual site plan application for parcels 06-392-0003 and 06-3. Am I? Sorry.
You're doing great. Keep going.
Okay, sorry, I thought I heard somebody breaking in. 06-392-0004 with the following directives, 1 through 4, plus the 5th one is review required amendments to subdivision plat and PDO approval for reasons for actions A through B in the staff report.
I'll second.
It's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion or debate? All right, Commissioner Summerhays.
Aye.
Commissioner Kerr.
Aye.
Commissioner Wright.
Aye.
Commissioner Daly.
Aye.
Commissioner Wilcox.
Aye.
And I'm an aye as well. Thank you, guys. And moving to the second to last item on our agenda, item number 6, Community Development Director's Report and City Council Update. I'll turn the time over to staff.
Coming back on. And okay, you see that? It's just share. Can exit out of that. So we're looking at the council update. Just by way of information, at their June 3rd meeting, the council brought up the discussion in the regular meeting, residential buffer standards. I do think this was driven out of the discussion with the Hive development. I went over with them the city codes regarding where we buffer and where we don't buffer. And one of the places that we do not have a mandatory buffer is between different types of residential. So we do have some through commercial. We do have some as they develop a PDO, but we do not have mandatory buffer requirements between types of residential. So they gave us a directive to go back to the ordinance, look at residential buffering between types of uses or between certain types of zones. And also compare that in adjacent to what we require in the commercial areas and bring some sense to some additional buffering. Because the discussion is how much of a buffer should we establish? And so they said compare it to the commercial. They placed it on a high priority equal to the Main Street efforts. In all actuality, I think we could probably address this and move it on forward while we're doing the Main Street edits. And I think the Main Street edits will lag behind. I do think the residential buffering is a discussion, but I think it's a relatively short discussion. And so we'll be bringing that to you in the near future to answer the council's request. We do have items for your next planning commission meeting. We have Symphony Homes, Summerhill Lane, or we also call it around here the DeVore property, even though Symphony Homes actually owns some property in addition to the DeVores. And so they are going to amend their subdivision that you've seen in the past to a PDO. And part of that is the discussion that happened at the council about how is the improvements developed and rather than segment the property into a development that would create some difficulties in the future. So they're going to go for a PDO and modify some of our base provisions in the new zone request of RL. Bank of America, this is a conceptual site plan, or the former Iggy site. They have submitted for a conceptual site plan to remove that building and build a new building. So we'll go through that process. And Centerpoint Theater, as you know, COVID-19 has certainly made a devastated the ability to host performances. And so they would like a temporary conditional use permit to hold some outdoor concerts through the end of June, most of July, and early August. And then, as always, I put your commission goals. And once again, I get to report. We've got them underway, but we've been at a little bit of a hiatus.
Thanks, Corey. In fairness to us, we've been doing quite a bit the last few meetings. I feel like we've been very packed. So while I don't want to neglect our South Main Street planning, some things take priority. I feel like our focus has been appropriate. I look forward to seeing what you guys draft with regards to the buffering regulations.
I just wanted to comment as well. I've been working on the amendments to our medical cannabis ordinance that the Planning Commission had reviewed, I think back in December. So I finally made those amendments and would like to bring that back on the 24th if there's time. As well as we're working on a food truck ordinance. So in the last legislative session, there were some statutes adopted that take away some local control on food trucks. So we want to try to bring those back, but that'll probably be in July. And then obviously we'll try to resurrect our subdivision ordinance project as well.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. Sorry, I forgot the cannabis ordinance you put on our board.
Yeah, I'm fine adding the cannabis ordinance onto the next one. I mean, that may take a little bit of time, but I don't anticipate that it's going to be, hours and hours of discussion. Okay. Well,
I know that we as commissioners have talked a few times about looking at our parking, and that as we talked about today, and as we continue to talk about in several situations, we have a parking requirement that is slightly different than some of our neighbors, which is not a bad thing, but it is to the more restrictive end, which just slightly. And I know we've talked about, should we talk about that? Should we address that? Should we look at that? Should we figure out if that's something we want to change? And that would prevent some further hiccups for parking modifications or stuff down the road. So I'm just asking commissioners, are we still interested in talking about that? Is that something we'd like to have a discussion about, or are we just going to keep on keeping on?
Yeah. On your last goal session, the parking was on that list and it did not rise to the level of the current priorities, even though it was on the list. We also have the transportation element modification that matches the moderate income housing. And so I don't want to say parking wasn't important. It was on your list of your last discussion. It just did not rise to those top projects.
I remember I was gone that day, darn, when we voted.
And that doesn't mean you can't change the list. I'm just,
It's fine. I mean, if people don't feel like it's a priority, that's totally fine. It's just something that we keep getting. I mean, we're having a conversation about it today in this exact scenario. We're going to have another conversation. I'm guessing it's something that if we talked about it and we made a change that is more similar to Bountiful or something else, we might end up having a little bit less that we have to talk about, which is fine if we still want to talk about this. And if we believe that it's a good ordinance, then we're fine. That's fine. So.
Yeah, I think given that we have it on our list, I mean, it certainly hasn't been forgotten. We've just had other priorities that we've been focusing on the last few months. I'm glad you raised it because I think that we should still keep it on our radar. I think probably the next meeting is not the one to tackle that because it sounds like we've got a lot there, but let's remember it. Let's for sure keep it in mind. And when things kind of lighten up and we have a little bit more breathing room, let's consider whether we revisit that one again. So just keep bringing it up.
I was not suggesting it for next meeting, but my thought is if it's something that's important to us, we can say by this date and we can direct staff to give us some information by that date. Then they can have plenty of time to work on it and not be like, next meeting, give us this thing or whatever. But if it were something that we wanted, it could be by the end of the summer or something, we talk about it, you know.
I think it's a good thing to raise. I just want to say thank you to everybody. I think that you all have been doing a tremendous job. I say that of the Planning Commission, and I also say that of staff of working through a lot of challenging, technological hiccups and life hiccups and everything else that we've been dealing with. So thank you. And thank you also to Mackenzie. She's been continuing to send out updates with regard to training, which I really appreciate. I feel like I personally am going crazy in 37 different directions. So training is not my priority right now, but I appreciate that she's still thinking about it and still sending out training. So last item on our agenda, last but not least, the most exciting part of our meeting here, the minutes. So we'll do this as we normally do, page by page. If you have any changes, let me know. Starting with, so this is the minutes for May 27th of 2020. Any changes on page 1? Page 2, page 3, page 4. Chair will entertain a motion.
I move to accept the minutes from the 5/27/2020 Planning Commission as unamended.
Second.
Moved and seconded. We don't get very many unamended. Actually, lately we've been getting more and more unamended.
I was
So
gonna say, I like to make
Pick
sure
up
we
stuff.
know that they're unamended so that our recorder is adequately acknowledged.
she's been amazing. Any further discussion, debate? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And Corey just popped up on the screen. Before we adjourn, Corey, did you have something that you wanted to say?
He's on mute.
I wanted to join you to say goodbye, so I came back on.
Okay, fantastic. Lisa, are you also just saying goodbye? All right. Thank you, everyone. I move that we adjourn.
Second.
Dog in the background, I love it. It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Thank you guys all. I'll see you at the next meeting.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
See you guys.